Hey guys, I decided to make this video hoping that many of you out there can relate. I know that when I was going through my son's illness, I felt like I was alone in the world, and so I hope that you guys can connect with this. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. My husband and I met when we were in high school. We were high school sweethearts. I was a freshman and he was a junior. And we dated all through high school, dated all through college. He stayed home to go to college and I went away. It was the fairy tale. We ended up getting married about 3 months after I graduated from college. And we were married for a while before we decided to have any children. Got pregnant with a sweet baby boy, and the pregnancy was completely normal. He was full term, all was well. And he was well for about the first 5 weeks, and then at 5 weeks old he developed RSV and had to be hospitalized for about a week on intravenous antibiotics. And the reason I say this is I think that it all just spiraled down from there. But let me backtrack a second, because when he was 1 day old, he was jaundiced, very much so. Had to come home with the bilirubin light. We had to go for several days after that back up to the hospital to get his little heel pricked. He was very jaundiced, and of course he received the Hep B vaccine while his liver was not functioning properly to filter out all those toxins in that vaccination. And unfortunately, I just didn't know any better. I just really disagree with physicians who will immunize an infant, a brand newborn, who is showing signs of being jaundiced. I think that there should be some kind of different medical protocol, and hopefully one day there will be. But anyway, he did get the hepatitis B vaccine when he was about 1 day old and jaundiced. About 5 weeks later, he developed RSV. We were in the hospital for about a week. The week after we came home from that, he received all of his regular on-schedule immunizations at 8 weeks. And I'm getting my dates mixed up, but I guess he was 7 weeks old when we were in the hospital with RSV, and then the very next week is when he got his regularly scheduled immunizations. And for that entire year, he battled illness after illness, multiple ear infections with antibiotics, a couple of bouts of pneumonia, of course with antibiotics. He just stayed sick. And then at just before his first birthday, we were in the car headed to my parents' house and for an extended family Christmas get-together. Eli's birthday is December the 17th, and he had his first seizure in the car on the way there. So thankfully we were right by a hospital. My husband drove us straight there. Of course, I was freaking out. We got there. He was pretty much just diagnosed as having a febrile seizure, fever-induced. They said that would likely be the only one he would ever have. I was glad to hear that. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So for about the next year, continued illnesses, RSV, ear infections, pneumonia. Again, he's approaching 2 now. He starts developing what they diagnosed as cyclical vomiting syndrome. So he would have what we thought were stomach viruses, but they became so regular that they actually diagnosed him with a syndrome of vomiting in a cyclical pattern or a cyclical pattern. So they medicated him for that. And then we started noticing that he was delayed in certain areas. He wasn't really making as much eye contact as I was expecting. He was delayed with his speech. So he was presenting with spectrum symptoms. Definitely presenting with hyperactivity, so attention deficit hyperactivity. He was on the spectrum. Even at 4, his pediatrician prescribed some Metadate and that's rare for them to prescribe those types of medications at 4, but he was just uncontrollable behaviorally, and was trying to get some kind of help with occupational therapy. He was just borderline. He was just on the edge, and he was still so young. There were not a lot of services available to us at the time. In the meantime, we couldn't keep him in a preschool or a daycare setting. Even a church, like Sunday school, Sunday nursery was difficult because behaviorally he was just such a handful. He was hyperactive, impulsive, injurious to other kids. And no doctor, no one anywhere ever told me that the symptoms he was having neurologically could be related to the symptoms he was having behaviorally. And so I just thought we had two different things we were dealing with, which obviously was not the case now that I'm looking back in hindsight. And then around the age of 3, we got the diagnosis of epilepsy. Of course, that overshadowed anything behaviorally that was going on because it was difficult to get those seizures diagnosed. He was having primarily complex partial seizures where he would have an aura and then he would zone out. He would have automatisms, digging for things, drooling, unresponsive as far as, he didn't know where he was. He couldn't answer simple questions, didn't know my name when I would ask him. After a couple of minutes of that, he would come out of it. He would usually have a post-ictal state, meaning he would be just wiped out, extremely exhausted, extremely tired after that. And so this was the pattern. He just continued to be delayed behaviorally. Although he made some contact, he had moments where we saw his personality come out, and then he had blank moments too. And then the seizures just continued to persist. He did have an episode at the age of 5. This was his first time that he had a generalized seizure, meaning that he had your I guess what people would consider a typical seizure where he shook all over. Unfortunately, he didn't come out of that on his own, so he went into what's called status epilepticus. So we had to get him to the ER. They had to administer lots of Ativan medication to get him to actually stop seizing. That was a pretty difficult place to be. In fact, I had literally just walked in the front door of my house from having to have a D&C following the birth of my third son for a placenta retrieval. So I had an overnight stay in the hospital. My parents brought me home, and my husband said, "We have to go to the ER. Eli's having a seizure. I can't get him to come out of it." So literally, I never put my purse down. At that point, we were just on our knees in the ER. We saw him literally seize for 2 solid hours, even with 2 different injections of the Ativan. He still wasn't coming out of it. They transferred us to a different hospital, Children's and Women's Hospital, and finally at that point he began to get back to normal and come out of his seizure state. And then, so that was around the age of 5. Moving on, I was just continuing to research. We were trying different medications, anticonvulsants, to get him to stop seizing. No medication was working to stop the seizures. Many of them made his symptoms, behavioral symptoms, much worse. Lots of weight gain, weight loss, aggression, increased the impulsivity, just you name it, the side effects were horrendous, almost worse, or maybe even at times worse than the seizure events themselves. It was just a really, really, really hard place to be. And then my career, I was a marriage and family therapist working at a church, and he was at a private school for his kindergarten year. And the first week of his first grade, I just couldn't take it anymore. I could not continue to send him to school, not knowing when he was going to seize. Even though I was in the building next door, I just couldn't take it. So unbeknownst to my husband, I drive over to the school, I take him out, just withdraw him from school. Thankfully, they handed me all of his books that I had paid for because it was a private school, and I just began to homeschool him. At this time, we had 2 other boys who were younger, a newborn and then a 2.5, almost 3-year-old too. So I just decided to quit my job, stay home, sold the van, the Honda Odyssey that I drove in order to just not have to work, to stay home and commit all that I had at the time to trying to help Eli, and so I researched. I got a Google degree in neurology. Literally, I feel like I have a degree in pediatric neurology. I just continued to try to dig and find ways to help him because medication was not helping. About that time, I got diagnosed with celiac disease, which is a blessing because it made me realize how much food was affecting my health. So I began to transition Eli to a gluten-free, dairy-free diet because it was shown in the autism world that that was a healthy, helpful diet for those spectrum kids to be on. So about 2 weeks of that, he began to really improve behaviorally. His impulsivity was much improved. His eye contact was better. He smiled more often. He just seemed more at ease in his own body. So that was helpful. Unfortunately, the seizures still persisted, but I realized at that point that food was playing a role, a big role, and I just knew all along that food was still playing a role with his seizures, but I just didn't have it tweaked right. And so I just continued my research, and in the meantime, he continued to seize just relentlessly. I mean, he would seize every month. So he might go 30 days of being seizure-free, and then on day 31, he would have clusters of seizures. Most of the time, they were complex partial. Again, he had a handful of those generalized seizures where we would end up in the hospital for medication to bring him out of it. In fact, one time we were at the ER, and I was so educated at this point with what questions to ask because I wanted to find out about lab results, and I wanted to find out, what was causing him to do this. And I had one ER doctor just look at me after I probably asked 18 questions in a row. I'm sure I got on her nerves. And she just looked at me in a very condescending way, and she said, you just might have a shaker on your hands. And I knew right then and there that I was going to pray, and I was going to dig, and I was going to research until I found some answers, because I knew that this was not how God intended for Eli to live. And I knew that this was not what he had in mind for our family. And so I continued. I just dug my heels in further. And moving on, at this point, he's had the same pattern of be pretty healthy for about a month and then have cluster seizures for about a month. And this happened for almost a decade, a good 9 years. And he was around 10, and it was Christmas Eve. So he probably had just turned 10, and it was Christmas Eve, and I got up extra early for me. I'm not much of a morning person. It was around 5:30. And I just wanted a quiet morning, so I got up and I was fixing some coffee, and I heard this rhythmic banging coming from Eli's bedroom. And so I knew. So I flew to his room, and I flung open his door, and there he was in the throes of a generalized seizure. And I had no idea how long he had been seizing because I had just gotten up. I had just woken up and was fixing some coffee when I realized the rhythmic sound coming from his room. His tongue was all chewed up. His white sheets were bloody. He was sweating all over and rigid. And so that was another ER trip. And when we got him home and he was back to his self, out of the seizures, able to think clearly, my husband and I prayed with him, and we said, this is the year. This is the year that our prayers are going to be answered. We're not going to accept anything less. And we told him, we said, buddy, this is the year you're going to get well. We're not going to do this anymore. So I was very assertive with his pediatric neurologist, and we had been all over for pediatric neurologists. We had been in Mobile at Children's and Women's Hospital. We'd been to Birmingham at Children's Hospital. We had been to Sacred Heart Hospital in Pensacola. We'd been all the way to Chicago to doctors to see about health. We ended up back in Mobile with a neurologist who is European, and he seemed to really value my input.